off.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Melinda, if you don't mind, and just remind everybody where we're at in terms of the mapping, and then we can get into the more detailed discussion of ordinances and the examples from other towns. Just flip the two on the agenda. Does that work?
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. You want to do the noise ordinance before?
No, forgive me.
No.
Aren't there two subsections in
The-
what we're talking about?
Yeah, go ahead. You have the floor.
Yeah,
Great,
mapping
thank you.
first, then rules. Yep, go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me back. A real pleasure to be with you. Let's just get this going. Oh, let's try that the other way. There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to briefly remind ourselves of where we're at with this mapping, because it has been a few, I guess a couple months since I was last with you. And so I'm just going to review the products that we have so far and then talk about some of the new additions here. So I'll just go quickly through this. We redid the forest blocks that are at the base of the significant wildlife habitat area in Williston. When I say the base, I mean they're the framework that other elements are built around. And we did this using new 2016 LiDAR-derived forest canopy data that you see here. This is a road. You see the forest canopy data crosses the road. So we had to buffer the roads to separate out what was which forest block. And so there were, in this new definition, there were 27,000 features that came out, 27,000 forest blocks in the town, but we've really focused in on those 46 that are larger than 20 acres. You can see all 27,000 at the left. You can see the 46 of them at the right, and here I colored them by size. Then we went on to redo the wildlife road crossing. So the model of where wildlife is likely to cross over the roads. We began with that same forest canopy data set. We added to that the supplemental wetlands data. Again, this is from that 2016 LiDAR-derived land cover data. This is not the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory. This is going to be a little bit more expansive. And then we created this grid on all of the road systems, on all the roads in Williston, and we had a little bit of issues making sure we got the right set of roads. Thanks again for your help there, Melinda. Then we analyzed which of those blocks in the grid had more than 80% cover. And then we cross-checked for where there was more than 80% cover on both sides of those roads. And we came up with these wildlife road crossings. And so I believe there are 276 of those in the town that we then further distilled. So here's, I believe that's where we left off, was the presentation of wildlife road crossings. And so when we last met, we had both the wildlife road crossings and the new forest blocks. And it was my task to go through the other parts of the significant wildlife habitat area and look for how to match those up. So how to complete the definition of significant wildlife habitat area beyond just forest blocks and crossings. So I just have 3 slides here just to remind us what Vermont Conservation Design says are the most important areas. Again, that dark green is the highest priority. I know I'm going pretty fast here. For folks that are new to this, I apologize, but we've been through this several meetings in a row, so I'm just trying to catch everyone up. So then we see the selection of interior forest blocks, the selection of connectivity blocks, a couple more things, the riparian wildlife connectivity and the physical landscape block. Okay, so then we took those 46 blocks, the newly created ones, and I divided them up into 2 tiers, the first tier blocks and the second tier blocks. And when we last met, we discussed which went into which block. We spent a lot of time discussing that central block. And I was asked, why is that a second tier and not a first tier? And so we talked about that separation of which blocks were considered first tier, those most important ones, and which blocks were considered second tier. So now, my suggestion is that we include a lot of the features in the significant wildlife habitat area under this definition of primary conservation area. And so we see here the tier 1 blocks. So, and I want to flag that because that is a large land area. The other items in this list are smaller land area. They're more sensitive, they're more vulnerable. So as we think about this primary conservation area, these are the features that are most ecologically important. And so we would want the highest regulatory standard, in my opinion, for a primary conservation area. But let's just flag that those blocks, those forest blocks, is a huge land area. And so that might prevent our ability to assign a higher standard for these other features if we include that here in the primary. But ecologically speaking, these forest blocks are the backbone, the anchors of the network, and then these are finer scaled items that are incredibly important and sensitive. So in total, that primary conservation area looks like this. Those are all of the first tier forest blocks that I had described, and those other items. All of these are now red in the map that I'm just flipping back and forth between. But I did take the first tier wildlife road crossings and put those in yellow. Okay, so then we have the secondary conservation area, and that includes those tier 2 blocks, as well as the uncommon species and the second tier wildlife road crossings. And that's what these look like, and those second tier crossings are in the light green. And so when you put that together, it's a map like this. It's a similar total land area to what's currently in your significant wildlife habitat area, but it is differently prioritized than what you have in there now. Now, then when we last met, we also discussed the ag fields, and you all were pretty clear that we didn't want to drop those. So we included those as a tertiary review, and those ag fields still need some review. We had talked about that a little bit. Okay, so the most recent work that I've done, other than mapping the other features for those primary and secondary tiers, is exploring what going back to those forest blocks and seeing if there are certain parts of the block that are more important than others with respect to this relationship of habitat blocks, the cores, and the connectors. And so what I did is I looked at each individual block and I buffered it in 300 meters. So I was able to show the core area of each of the forest blocks, whether it's a secondary in orange, and so the core area is that dark brown, or the primary, and that core area is the darkest red. So that leaves this band around the edge of the block. Then I took segments of that band, that 300-meter band, and I called them either connecting, which you see is a darker red here, or just edge, where they have a lower significance there. So I'm now trying to get you that finest detail of what parts of the perimeter of the block are most important for connectivity. And so this is the best way that I've been able to figure that out.
Can I ask a question, Jens?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So is, and I'm probably skipping ahead, but so is the point of this to say that when we think about trying to conserve the primary, it is too much to try to conserve the entire primary because it hamstrings you in terms of how stringent the regulations can be, because it's just too much land area that it applies to. But if we are more strategic about applying it to the parts that are both connected to the core and connected between different core habitat areas, we can be a bit more specific about protecting them. Is that where you're headed?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. That's exactly what I wish I had said in those words. Yeah, because we don't want you to be in the same situation that you are now, where you have this massive area in your significant wildlife habitat area, and we're leaving it up to the DRB to prioritize those. We haven't given enough tiers of priority to be clear to other parts of the planning and regulatory apparatus on what's most important. And so they're coming up with decisions that maybe aren't best ecologically because we haven't given them that level of prioritization. So we're trying to be more clear on what's most important in this overall area. And so basically we've exploded your old significant wildlife habitat area into its component parts. And now we're reforming those component parts and trying to place them into tiers. And so just to show you, here's that old area and here is that new area. They're very, very similar. Okay, then just a few, this is just your existing standards. So from my Reader's Digest version, there are lots of words here, but at the end of the day, there's actually kind of minimal protection because it gets to that where practical line in your current regs. I also just want to highlight that your current regs really rely on this difference between core and corridor, right? Those concepts are really baked into the significant wildlife habitat area of core and corridor. And that's great as a concept. It's very difficult to regulate, to decide what is a corridor because of all of the things we've added into the primary, the wetlands, the riparian habitats. Yes, those are part of the corridor, but they're also features in their own right. So having the core corridor as the primary distinction in the regs makes it very difficult to decide what all is a corridor. These are your the standards. I'm just going to keep going here and just give you so this is the end. This is the last slide. We've already seen this one, but so we have these concepts of this primary conservation area and this secondary conservation area. We have different elements fit in. We have a set of blocks in the primary. We have a set of blocks in the secondary. We have a set of road crossings in the primary. We have a set of road crossings in the secondary. And then we have other features in both primary and secondary. I've done essentially the same exact work with Waitsfield in the last year as I've been working with you all. And I just want to show you what they've come up with in the last 3-4 months related to this. And what they've done is really define corridor as a whole list of potential elements, but they assign the standards to the primary and the secondary rather than assigning standards to core and corridor. Are you with me on that? Okay, let me just show you what Waitsfield has done. I'm going to go through their definitions because it's the easiest way to show you. So here's their primary, right? They refer directly to a map. This is the definition that's going into their town plan, but they are trying to use the town plan as basis for regulation. So they're looking very closely at what this will mean for their regulatory world. So while this is town plan related, what Waitsfield has been doing, they're really looking at how this is going to impact their regs. So here for their primary, many of the same items, elements are included here that are included in yours. In this case, they have a detailed field inventory that allows them to parse out natural communities a little bit differently than you all did. And they also have some high elevation habitat that you all don't have. So that's their definition of primary. We can come back to these in a second. I'll show you. Then they have this definition of secondary. And note that the vernal pools, you see that? This has a 100-foot buffer in the primary, and then here's the migratory zone, the donut of the first one was the donut hole. This is the donut, the rest of the vernal pool buffer. They have some other features that were defined in their field inventory. Then they have these second tier blocks, and this is essentially the same as what you all have, those tier 2 forest blocks. Okay, and wait, go ahead. Was there a question? Sorry, I can't see your faces at this moment.
I'm with you, Jens. I don't see a question at this time.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
So here's their definition of significant wildlife habitat. And so here's they include a laundry list of features in this definition, including core habitat, forest blocks as a little bit different than the core. So those are all of the forest blocks. And then many of those same items that you all have. And then lastly, I'll show you what they did. They pulled out the primary forest blocks from their primary conservation areas. So they're able to assign a much higher standard to their primary conservation area, assign a lower standard to the primary forest block because we have more flexibility there. Those are the most important forests, but because they're so large, we have more flexibility. So they're assigning a slightly lower standard to the primary forest blocks than they do to the primary conservation areas. And then they have another standard, a lower standard for the secondary conservation areas. Okay, that's all I have. I know I just got real technical real fast. I'm gonna stop my screen for a second just so I can see you all and figure out what that did for you. So are you clear? Are you with me on the basics of what the mapping involved? Of taking those forest blocks and dividing them up into a primary and a secondary. Are we good on the science there?
Any questions from commissioners on the mapping piece? Eric, I can't see your face, so just speak up if you want to. And then the second piece of it, Jens, was about nomenclature. What do we call things and how do we identify them in definitions so that we can then create rules that apply to those different categories in a better or more effective way than ours currently do. And
exactly, and yours hang on this, on defined corridors. And so you all have these corridor areas and you set different standards for them, but your corridors overlap your core. And so then you asked me to separate those out so we could get two different standards. And I'm telling you, I don't like assigning a standard to the word corridor.
yeah,
There's so many different features in there. So I'm suggesting that you all switch your nomenclature so that we can attach standards to something different than that word corridor.
there was one thing you said toward the end, Jens, that I had a question about, which is you started to talk about separating out that tier 1 blocks. So is it safe to say that Waitsfield is essentially having 3 categories? They have tier 1 and primary and secondary, and then they also have separated out an even higher priority item or a entirely separate definition of something that they can regulate against that they're calling their tier 1 forest blocks? Do they kind of have 3?
Yeah, well, they kind of have 4 actually. So they have the primary conservation area, the secondary conservation area, the primary forest blocks are what you were calling that 3rd. And then what I'll say is the 4th is that significant wildlife habitat. And that they use in their, they use that other in like subdivision. So it just allows them to say, it allows them to map an area and have standards attached to it that would work in other instances.
Okay, so if somebody's subdividing and it's already not going to be protected very well through the primary and secondary because it's already quote unquote developed area, maybe it gives them more flexibility to have the sustainable, the significant wildlife habitat area. Yep. Okay. I'm good up till there. Anything else you guys want to ask at this point?
I'm just seeing something from Eric in the chat. One question that I think I missed. You had notes on several slides regarding ag lands that need to be addressed. Is that the next step? I have some local knowledge to contribute for one of the parcels near me that can inform one of the secondary segments. That is the next step. Melinda, that's something that we had talked about you're potentially reviewing at some point, is just taking a look at those fields, because we haven't looked again at those. Those are what, the 2006 fields, I think, that Spatial Analysis Lab identified. And we just wanted to go back and look at those again.
Right. One thing, okay. So I guess if I understand it correctly, the work that you've done to date, it does establish the connections between the, okay, got it.
Yeah, it absolutely establishes those corridors. It shows them in no uncertain terms. But I don't like attaching the standards to that word corridor, because there are so many different features in there. There are wetlands in there. There's riparian habitat in there. In some cases, there are rare species in there. And so regulating them based on the word corridor doesn't do justice to the underlying features that are incorporated into your corridors, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Another question, do you think it would make sense to try to do, I don't know, some inventory of maybe like vernal pools, for example, to try to get a better handle on where the vernal pools are in town, to include those?
I'm never going to say no to inventory, but do I think that's necessary for you to redo these definitions? No, I don't think that's the necessary next step. It would be great to have a better handle on those wetlands and vernal pools at some point. I'll wager you have some other rare species that you don't yet know about too, and inventory, doing more of a field-based inventory would help there as well. But I don't think you want to hold up this process to do that inventory.
I think VCE is doing a in-depth inventory of vernal pools in the area. So you might want to reach out to Kevin Toblin, I think his name is.
Kevin, Terry, what was that, Kevin?
Toblin, is that right, Carl?
Say again?
Kevin Toblin from VCE.
Tolan, yeah.
Tolan, yeah, from VCE.
I didn't hear your question.
I was just saying that Kevin was working on vernal pools in the state.
Yes, he is. Yeah. As well as grassland breeding birds.
If I may, I just see a note from Tim. in the chat about how do you create rules to protect corridors when you focus standards on the core. And a reminder, we're going to have standards for both the core and the corridors. We're just changing that nomenclature to be primary and secondary. In Waitsfield's definition, for example, they do define both connectivity and wildlife road crossings. In their definition of connectivity, they include wildlife road crossings and all sorts of other features that can be a part of that connecting land. So all of those items have standards attached to them. It's just we're not attaching the standards to that specific word corridor.
I started looking at, different examples of draft language. And so where I sort of got with that is that there's several towns that have, I think, that are working on their standards, but that so far have pretty vague regulatory standards. And then there's South Burlington on the other end of the spectrum. And like, I think that we do need to have specific defensible standards, but I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around the South Burlington regulations, because they
seem very complex. Yeah.
Very cumbersome. And I just wonder how it's going to work out in practice to try to implement those standards in a regulatory framework, and how that's going to work. I mean, I couldn't even really figure out what it was like if I was a DRB member, I wouldn't really know what, what the standards are trying to get me to do, I guess. I mean, I guess they seem really complicated. So I'm just wondering how to adopt standards that are both specific enough to be legally defensible, but not so complex as to be impossible to put in practice. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I won't comment in great detail about South Burlington. I have been working with them pretty closely for the last 2 years. I will say that South Burlington is more developed than Williston is.
For sure.
And so in the southern part of South Burlington in particular, they're trying to regulate the habitat that's left, but there's so little left that in some cases they want to regulate areas that an ecologist might not say is quality habitat right now. They want to leave the door open for restoration, and they want to just say no more development. We don't care how bad that looks right now, but we still can't develop it. It will be good habitat into the future.
Yeah, if we protect it, if we revitalize it, it will be effective habitat at some point.
Right, and that's made things very difficult for them, because they'd love it if they could have a consultant just say, this is important quality habitat. It's already been fragmented and degraded, and so no ecologist is going to say that's important. But from a conservation planning perspective, you can say that is going to be important, or that is important. It is still serving some sort of ecological function. Anyway, my point is just in South Burlington, because it's more developed, they have to regulate areas that are just more difficult to regulate.
I guess kind of what I'm envisioning, based on like what you showed us about breaking these areas down into several different levels, is I could sort of see like a system similar to what South Burlington is doing, in that you're saying, we would really prefer it if you'd stay out of all of these areas. If you have to develop within a significant wildlife habitat area, in order, this is the order from like highest to lowest priority, and wherever possible, start with the lowest priority areas and impact those areas first. and sort of review it in that way. But kind of translating that to language is going to be the challenge.
It is a challenge, and I would suggest that by way of next steps, I think just looking at the definitions is really helpful. And then once you have the terms defined, then it's a little bit easier to imagine a regulatory framework around those. And that's what we did in Waitsfield, was develop that full list of definitions and make sure that there's no language floating around in the town plan or the zoning regs that isn't defined. Go through and redefine all of those. And then once you have parsed out how you want those definitions to look, then you can think a little bit more about the regulatory standards. So it's more muddied than that, because as you're defining the definitions, you want to be clear about what's in and what's out. So anyway, it's a little bit of an iterative process, but handling those definitions is going to be the easiest way for commission members to understand a framework. Would be my suggestion for a first step.
And on this call, I'm interested to hear from commissioners if anybody has, is everybody feeling like it's a good approach to continue down this road of primary and secondary, and sort of Jens's recommendation to move away from regulating corridors and instead just define a corridor, but regulate against that primary and secondary habitat area? Does that make sense, so that we can all agree that we're on the right path and we can start talking about definitions?
Yeah. Just a couple of comments. Number one, Hans has developed some very complex maps for us, which I think are good. I think they're really helpful. And I'm wondering if we could move into the direction of complex maps with simple descriptions for regulations. And let me just start with the notion of areas that we consider the highest priority for wildlife. Are we in a position politically to be proscriptive about it, to say no development in these areas because they're the highest priority? Or is that too much? Is that too strong?
Well, one of the things that I like, Carl, about to Melinda's point about South Burlington, there were some things that made me confused or struggled to understand how to implement what they have. However, one of the things I really did like is this concept that that through management and careful planning, we can actually improve the quality of some areas. And so there are times where somebody might be able to restore one area, even if they need as a offset for impacting to a certain extent another area. So I wonder whether, if we were to be too black and white about within the confines of these areas on this map, there is no development at all, whether we would miss opportunities to potentially have that give and take with someone who wants to do something with part of their land, and we could be improving the habitat in another part of their property. That's the only concern I have about doing something like that. But I do think that we don't want to end up where South Burlington is today, where they're sort of scrambling to protect what's left instead of being proactive about protecting what's good from the beginning. I'll leave it there, and I know, Laura, you also wanted to comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I feel really good about the approach that Jens has put out to prioritize, because to me, just having this map of priority lands and corridors has always been like, something that you could kind of get around. And if we do have those tier 1 areas and forest blocks, we can put a little bit more of a restriction on those, even if it's no development, some kind of just, you know, possibly restrict development there.
Yeah, I agree that I'm thinking 30, 50 years down the road, Williston may look like South Burlington if nothing's done right now to protect those areas. So I think it's a good idea.
I just wanted to comment briefly on what Carl said. It seems kind of scary to me to all of a sudden put some, some red areas or some areas on a map that say restricted, no development here. It seems like we'd be kind of setting ourselves up for a lot of legal issues potentially with something like that. I think having rules and regulation that govern what can be done in them might have the same effect, but not be quite as hard to do. I don't know if I said that well, but
Be a political problem for sure.
yeah, I think you're right.
I mean, one thing to note is that we already do have areas where we say you can't develop, like 150 feet from the Allen Brook and 50 feet from streams and wetlands. I guess we have the benefit of having, as for the 50-foot buffer, state regulations
yeah.
that are consistent with the town regulations. But nonetheless, yeah, the 150 foot buffer can be quite restrictive. So I don't know.
Are there ways, this isn't a question I want answered today, but a question to make sure is in the minutes, Melinda, so as we continue this conversation is, what are ways that we can make sure that, for someone who's a landowner and some of their land that they someday might want to subdivide, develop, whatever, what are ways that we can give pathways to be compensated for that? Can we help them with getting conservation easements, or are there ways that people can get compensated other than building a home or selling the land to somebody else to construct something? Because I think that's where it gets really difficult, is for
Well,
folks who wanted to do something and then financially they are impacted.
well, I mean, so we have like sort of a loose transfer development rights program, and certainly strengthening that and tying it to this, sort of as an exchange. Like if your development is really restricted, I mean, to the extent where you cannot reasonably develop your property with these regulations, then you can do a transfer of development rights. You can maybe transfer your development rights, or I don't know.
Development rights could be purchased by somebody trying to build in the Taft Corners area, for instance.
Right, like maybe the town could purchase the development rights in that case. It might also be good to do kind of an exercise to determine, who or how many property owners might be impacted, because if you're in the ag rural, you already have, if you're developing more than 10.5 acres, you already have a requirement to protect 75% of that. So, I don't know, just there may be ways of trying to figure out how impactful this will be.
But that carrot aspect, I want to be working on that at the same time as we're working on the stick of how do we stop people from touching stuff that's valuable.
Yeah.
Eric, did you have any comments on this particular topic?
Sorry, Reed. No, I do not have anything to add at this point.
Okay.
Just look at all the times we've purchased development rights back since the 1980s. Just look at Catamount.
Yep.
The town has certainly invested in protecting valuable land.
So it sounds like there's sort of a consensus that we need to look at not just the maps and the regulatory language, but also what are the other impacted things, the ERF funding, transfer of development rights programs that we have talked about a little bit in the past. All of those might be part of a solution that protects the benefits for landowners as well as the conservation at the same time.
Mhm.
So Jens, you're recommending we take the next step by looking at the definitions and trying to really well define the stuff that is most applicable to Williston.
Correct. Next steps, you look at those definitions and you define all those terms and you revisit the ag fields and double check those. And when you get into the weeds of the definitions, you're then going to be confronted with that last slide of how do you want to treat those primary forest blocks, the first tier forest blocks. And do you want to regulate within the forest block, AKA that band of edge versus connecting versus core? Do you want to use that science or not? And so when you dive into the definitions, that will be the opportunity to get further into the weeds of saying, is that useful in adding? Do we want to add the connecting section of the forest blocks to our definition of corridor? Or not, but that'll all happen in that define the terms work item.
Okay. So Melinda, we're on time for this topic. Are you feeling good from a planning perspective that this is a good place to pause and we can begin working on the definitions ahead of a follow-up at a future meeting?
Yeah, that sounds good. And Jens, if you could send me your latest GIS files, that would be great. It'd be really helpful.
Roger that. Yep,
Thank
I'll
you.
get you all of that science and so just to be clear, I'm gonna, I'm starting to step back a little bit. I think a lot of my work is done, but I'm really happy to continue to be involved in these definitions. I do think it's going to be a little bit of a back and forth as you work on the definitions. So I'm happy to continue to be involved in that. But I do think the bulk of our mapping work has been concluded. But
Yes.
I'm going to stick around to help with those defining terms, but just wanted to be clear about sort of my trajectory.
Thank you so much, Jens. The mapping alone is just a massive undertaking, and regardless of how we implement it, it will be very, very useful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I have my next steps and I will give Melinda the GIS and then she and I can continue to be in communication as the definitions come together.
All right. Next up, we have our discussion of the noise ordinance variance request.
Let's see. Actually, I did not open this.
That's all right. While you get that up, Melinda, are you willing to introduce this topic for us, or do you have a recommendation on how to begin?
Let's see. I saw Eric Wells a second ago, and I was, oh, there he is.
Hey, Eric.
So maybe Eric.
Welcome.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm on listen to the discussion this morning, but I believe you do have some guests here, Jacob from USDA and Joe from Casella. But the select boards received a noise ordinance variance request under our noise ordinance in the industrial zone. There's a decibel limit, and the USDA is working to address some bird congregation issues over near the Casella facility on Avenue B by using some devices known as bird bangers and screamers to manage that So the select board had an initial discussion and is looking for some additional feedback on the request for the noise ordinance variance from the commission. And I'm gathering some additional information for the board as well. So I know Jacob and Joe can speak to this more specifically and answer any questions the commission has. And I'll be here to answer any process questions and mainly just to listen this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. There was a significant amount of detail in the materials for the session today, but Jake and Joe, perhaps 2 minutes each, just give us any comments you might have for the context of the Conservation Commission reviewing this today. Anything you want to add to the materials that were provided?
This is Jake with USDA here. Thanks for having us on again. I'll let Joe kind of chime in after. Joe is our lead POC at our Casella agreements, basically statewide throughout the entire vicinity of Vermont, whether it be transfer station issues, some composting stuff, and landfill type airport issues. So, I mean, we gave a kind of long history of what's been going on here at the facility. And I'll let Joe kind of touch on maybe some of that because he has more insight on the overall history at the Avenue B location. But simply put, we're trying to assist Casella with reducing the bird issues at the facility. And for us, from an aviation standpoint of things, certainly it becomes a hazardous condition when we have birds crossing runways. And when we have birds in congregation at a nearby facility, that in place puts birds in the vicinity of traveling aircraft. So simply, we have done quite a few other mitigation measures at the location, you know, with effigies, bird dispersal, audio type devices. We've used bird in distress, anti-perching devices. There's some other proposals on the table for furthering those efforts. And simply, we're putting on the table the ability to be able to utilize pyrotechnic devices, which we use statewide in the cities of Burlington and South Burlington as well already at this location to assist further in dispersing these birds that are rapidly becoming habituated to the facility. And I'll let Joe kind of chime in here a little bit as well.
You there, Joe?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Hey, Joe. Yep, now we can. Go ahead.
Okay, my apologies. Yeah, thanks, Jake. That was great. So I think, you know, as we look at over the course of a year, the gull issue isn't an issue that we have all the time. It's periodic. It somewhat aligns with their migratory patterns. And recently, with the state requiring the diversion of food scraps, we have developed a food scrap depackaging system, which manages food scraps from consumers. And we permitted, built, and developed a project. And once we did that, we began to see more gulls coming in. These gulls are hungry. They want to forage for food. There's an opportunity at this location. And, you know, what we want to do is add the pyrotechnics just as a tool in the toolbox to help control the gulls when it's needed periodically throughout the year. And we have a long-standing relationship with USDA, as Jacob has mentioned, and really lean on those guys to help us control the birds, because certainly, A, we don't want to have an issue with the airport, and B, you know, it's a quality of life concern for our people and our customers that come into the facility. And you can imagine having the gulls flying around overhead you know, what that does to vehicles and so forth. So so we're just looking for some support and want to continue to add tools to the toolbox to help control gulls.
Thanks, Joe. So it sounds, Eric, as though the select board is looking for a recommendation, an opinion from the Conservation Commission, if any, to advise them when they take up this issue at the next meeting.
Yeah, that's correct. And any feedback the commission has for the select board to consider, just process wise, because this the sound emitted from these devices slightly exceeds the decibel level within the noise ordinance for the industrial zoning district. The select board would have to grant a variance to allow this type of activity to occur.
All right, I'll turn it over to the commissioners for comments and discussion.
I just had a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Laura, and we'll come to you, Gary.
Oh, thanks, Gary. I just wondered, when you use these mitigation strategies at other places around the state, what has been the reaction? Do people call and say, what are these noises, or do people not even really kind of notice what's going on? I just wondered about that.
Honestly, Laura, thank you for the comment. We discharge these pyrotechnics daily at times at the airport. And if you're not on the airport environment itself, you won't even hear these devices. And in other areas that we utilize these devices, Coventry landfill is another one where we fire, you know, a lot of pyros throughout the course of a year, depending on the seasonality and whatnot. And no, it's not ever been an issue. And very rarely does anybody even realize what is going on. We've kind of thought internally a little bit about the noise that these would generate at the Casella Avenue B facility. And I would be willing to bet the noise amount that comes from these pyrotechnics would probably be overshadowed by some of the other operations nearby. And Eric, I think what we're trying to do here at the airport is get you some videos of these devices in use out here on the airport, so you can see, what they look like. And honestly, the screamers, which we utilize the most, if you're not within a couple 100 yards of that device, I would think it's going to be really unnoticed by the neighboring community.
Gary, you're up next.
Well, I had the exact same question as Laura, so it was already answered.
Okay, great.
So I just have something to add. So this is Terry, and I was at the select board meeting, and I hope folks were able to watch the video of that. There was a lot of good information in there. It was quite lengthy, and the Observer wrote a article on the bird bangers, and so that was more information. And I just want to say that I'm concerned about the plane traffic collision, any interference with the birds from the operation. So that's important. But I just think that maybe there are some other alternatives to consider. And the one that I talked about at the select board meeting was the use of the filament over the facility, which works quite well at the Redmond Road composting facility. So they've been able to, keep a lot of the gulls out and deter them coming there. And it just seems like, so this situation has evolved now that since last July, food waste scraps were not able to be put into the garbage that was packaged in bags before. Now it seems, I'm not sure if I have this all right, but the food waste is being bought to this facility on Avenue B. So this source of the food for the gulls is bought to this facility, and it's open and available to the birds. So they've found a great source of food, which seems to be right in the pathway of the airport. So maybe this operation is just in the wrong place. Maybe it needs to be relocated. I don't know. I think the gulls they're habituated to the, the food source there. Um, that it needs to be, either put in some kind of a deterrent like this filament, or maybe move it to a different location. And I think the pyrotechnic things that they use at the Redmond Road are a lot smaller. I don't think they're 110 decibels. And I'm just concerned about when these these devices are set off, that they're going to lift the birds and all en masse, and that's going to be even worse than gulls just migrate, flowing in a few at a time, whereas you're going to be lifting 200 birds at once into a flight path. And I don't know what the schedule is at the airport, but I live right in the flight path, and we get a fair amount of airplanes. I know they say they communicate with the airport, but that just seems a little scary to have that many birds flying up at once. And Jim McCullough actually brought up a good point to where, this is a management issue at Casella. And I don't know who's paying for the USDA to be there, but should the taxpayers be paying for this service? I'm not sure if it's Casella is paying for it or who, but I just think maybe this operation should be located, going to Redmond Road, where they're already dealing with food waste and they already have a facility set up there. And why not utilize that? So that was my comment.
Jake and Joe, could you address two things that Terry, at a minimum, that Terry just brought up? One being the filament used at Redmond Road, Green Mountain Compost, and whether that's been explored for this location, and the second being whether other locations for management of the food waste have been considered as more of a long-term solution given proximity to the airport.
I can chime in real quick. Essentially, the filament at the Green Mountain Compost Facility off Redmond Road has also been another tool in their box. One of which we've worked with them in recent years to get replaced. The monofilament degrades, and it does work to some extent. However, it's definitely not a cure-all. There's no question about that. The devices they also use at the Redmond Road site are the exact same devices that we're proposing to use here at the Avenue B location. Bird bangers and bird screamers have been around for a long time. These are not new devices. And the decibel levels of what they're using on Redmond Road are the same as what we have used daily in our arsenal to deter birds from other locations. Like I said, right here at the airport daily. We were out there this morning using pyrotechnics as well. So I'll let Joe chime in. The proposal's been there for the monofilament gridding above this location. I'm not going to even remotely chime in on the relocation of this facility at all. I'll let Joe talk about that. But I do just want to reiterate the fact that there is no one cure-all method for reducing bird hazards at any sort of facility that has regular food waste. The composting state regulations and the food handling has been creating issues across the state at other locations as well. This is not the anomaly at this situation. So this is one of those unforeseen wildlife conflicts that has arose from the adoption of a new technique of managing food and trash waste. So there's a lot of hands in play here as well. And gulls are incredibly long-lived, smart birds. And some of these birds are well in excess of 20 years old. So the education to these locations is extremely high. And food waste in general, whether it's direct food that's separated from trash or just household trash in itself, is going to create an attraction for these birds. This has historically been seen across the country, at landfills, transfer stations, the like. This composting and direct food handling is certainly something new in the state, and it's something that's going to definitely continue to evolve from a wildlife conflict side of things.
Jake, could you also, before we go to Joe, is there anything about the cost that you can speak to that Terry was asking about? What's the cost look like?
Yeah, so we work on a cooperative service agreement between the airport and the Vermont Air National Guard. Our efforts expand to offsite locations within the community, 3 to 5 miles from the center of the airfield, basically is what we look at possible locations that can create a hazardous situation for the airfield. Those are FAA regulations and guidance. Certainly this falls well within that buffer. And as far as our efforts over at Casella, you know, we've had a cooperative service agreement with Casella throughout the state of Vermont at other locations, this being no different. And Casella has had their hands in a lot of our long-term cooperative service relationships as far as funding goes from their side of things. So no, the dollars that we have at this facility are not coming from you know, the neighboring taxpayers at all. You know, this is an agreement that we've had at the airport to reduce aviation hazards with wildlife for quite some time. And this is just us really trying to expand these efforts to reduce the human health and safety hazard for trafficking aircraft.
So Casella's paying for the activities and they're making use of your expertise and shared interest. Is that right?
Yeah, they have been for a long time. Joe, maybe you can chime in on how many years it's been that you guys have had a cooperative funded relationship with USDA here in Vermont.
Yeah, so it's been over 23 years. I've been with the company for 23 years, and it's been active ever since I started. So it's been a long time. Speak a little bit to the monofilament and to the let's move the facility to another location question. So the monofilament is something that we've considered. It's a little problematic with the varying roofline heights at the facility. One of the challenges we have is when the bodies of the trucks go up, you know, we need quite a bit of vertical clearance. And we lack some of that without getting innovative with some power poles or something to get the height we need. And I think we've also had some conversations with USDA, and it may not be USDA. So I apologize, Jake, if I have this incorrect, but I understand that the gulls are able to make some birds have a certain flight path. When they come in, they come down at an angle, and when you have monofilament, it deters that flight path coming in. That's not necessarily the case with the gulls. They're able to maneuver through the monofilament a little bit easier, as I understand it. But I mean, it is something that we could look into a little bit further as a tool and toolbox. I think, as Jake has mentioned, the birds get used to certain things, and that's when it's effective for us to be able to move on to another technique. And as the younger birds come through, if they get discouraged, then they tend to not want to return to the site. And so this is sort of an evolutionary effort to try to get the younger birds to say, hey, you know, we didn't have a lot of success at 220 Avenue B when we were young. Let's not go back there. Some of these older birds who maybe had success want to come back because of the success they had earlier in their lives. Anyhow, the food scrap processing that we do there is a little bit different than what happens at Green Mountain Compost. And I also should just offer that facility is in competition with our facility. But we do a little bit different things. They do a large scale composting operation there. We do a smaller scale depackaging process where we could take like K-cups from coffee roasters or Ben and Jerry's ice cream and have a method to be able to separate the packaging from the food waste. So if the packaging can be recycled, we recycle the food packaging, and then the food waste can be mixed with water and used as a slurry and taken to a digester to create power. So we have different operations, And again, as a result of, the new regulation where food scraps are exempt from land disposal, we're trying to adapt to the new regulation and manage Vermont's food scraps in a unique way there at the site.
Thanks for addressing that, Joe.
And yeah, Joe has a valid statement with the monofilament gridding. The birds do find ways of getting down through there. And we've seen it at Green Mountain Compost, and in the past we've been reached out to by them directly for assistance at Green Mountain Compost as well. So I think it's definitely a tool that Casella and Joe and I can explore, with adding in combination to, other tools, pyrotechnics being one of them, to disperse birds before they become, so congregated in numbers there that, we have as many as 100 to 200 birds on the rooftops at the facility just looking for food scraps. And yes, we do have, I just want to make it clear with everybody here, we have a 100% direct communication line with air traffic control tower to do bird dispersal. That exists on the airfield, that exists at offsite locations. In the vicinity, we talk to tower all the time to make sure that we are not creating a increased hazardous situation by, say, towering gulls over the facility in the event that they are there in numbers that we have seen, just this past spring.
I have several comments that I would like to make about this whole thing. This is
Please, Carl.
Carl from the Conservation Commission. As I have reviewed all the information that you've sent out, I'm concerned about the lack of measurables here. Apparently, the goal of this whole program is to decrease the risk of bird aircraft collisions. I don't see anything about has there been any risk assessment of that? Are there actually any examples of bird aircraft collision at the Burlington Airport? In terms of numbers of birds, have you measured an increase in the number of birds, either at Casella or, more importantly, at the airport? You've focused on one target species, gulls, presumably ring-billed gulls, which are mostly the gulls that would come. How about other species, other target species? Are you concerned at all about crows? In the area, in this area, crows congregate. You can see them in the early evenings on Redmond Road. They congregate to fly from a northeast to a southwest direction to their evening roost. And I don't know exactly where that roost is, but it's in South Burlington someplace and maybe close to the airport. I'm concerned about how you plan to measure the effectiveness of this program once initiated. How are you going to measure, for example, the your goal of reduced risk to bird aircraft collisions? Are you going to be measuring the reduction, presumably, of birds at the noise source, which it sounds like that you've had previous data that that it does reduce birds at the noise source. How about, is it going to reduce birds at the airport? And then finally, I'm wondering, what about, have any concern about adverse effects and measuring adverse effects of this whole program? For the obvious one is noise pollution and its effect on humans in the areas, and I guess you'll probably measure that by the number of complaints that you get from people around, which may or may not be a lot. And how about the effect of this program on non-target species, on birds that are not the gulls that you're trying to reduce the number of? Now, around the Casella area, that may not be too important because your bird species around that area are, in addition to gulls, are mostly pigeons and starlings, at least from the times I've been over there on at Christmas bird count. But what about around airports? There is, and I don't know about Burlington Airport, but at least some of the airports, some of the smaller airports in this state, there are a number of grassland breeding species that are pretty rare, like grasshopper sparrows and upland sandpipers, and then more common are savanna sparrows. I'm wondering what the effect of this type of noise is on those very desirable species around the airports. So those are some of the concerns I have, and it just seems that it seems to me like you're saying, okay, well, we'll do this noise, we'll do these noise methods, but it doesn't seem like you're measuring too much either the effectiveness or the adverse effects of the whole program. Those are my comments about.
I'll try to answer all of those, Carl. You've got a laundry list there. We have an ongoing wildlife hazard assessment at the airport. We have for over 11 years now. So we're constantly monitoring the hazardous birds that are on the airfield. You touch on ring-billed gulls. Ring-billed gulls are the second most struck bird species of all history at Burlington International Airport. So yes, they are one of the most hazardous birds that we take into consideration in our management techniques, this being obviously one of them. As far as measuring the effectiveness goes, it's simply we can do that simply by bird survey count numbers, you know, what's at the facility. We've been documenting bird numbers at Casella now for quite a few years, as needed, you know, per the request of Joe and Casella at this and other locations. Like I said, we monitor numbers on the airport through systematic point count surveys. We've been doing that for a long time. The FAA actually mandates airports to do systematic wildlife hazard assessments, which is what we've been doing. The FAA also mandates systematic bird continued monitoring protocols, which we're doing. As far as measuring this direct success or relevance of the devices in combination at Casella, I think it's just a matter of some bird count surveys at the facility to see, you know, what our numbers are historically and where they go moving forward. Do the numbers get reduced? Do the numbers continue to increase? Obviously, we take that into consideration with furthering management techniques as to whether they're successful or not at this facility, as we do with others. As far as the effect that pyrotechnic devices, I guess is what you're pointing at, might have on non-targets, well, I think you've hit the nail on the head as far as species there at this direct location are quite limited as it is to primarily ring-billed gulls and European starlings and pigeons. And it's been documented historically that pyrotechnics have hardly any effect on passerine bird species, sensitive grass species whatsoever. We've been using pyrotechnic devices in cooperation with the state of Vermont on all state managed and owned operated airports, just as long as we have here at the Burlington International Airport. And we work collaboratively with Vermont Fish and Wildlife on the grassland management on airport properties. Is that answering or touching on all those topics, Carl? Or
yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Everything we do at USDA, we're a scientifically based organization, and you know, we certainly don't do anything without taking into consideration of what the effect may be on either the direct targeted species or the subsequent targeted species, you know, that may have an effect. That's why we have NEPA agreements and policy and permits in place to be able to do this and other operations throughout the entire state of Vermont, as well as nationally.
Okay, well, let me just ask a couple of specific questions. Have there been any examples of bird aircraft collisions at the Burlington Airport?
Yeah, as I said, Carl, ring-billed gulls are the second most struck species at Burlington. I think they equate for I'd have to look at my numbers, but I think it's close to 10% of all recorded bird aircraft strikes at Burlington are caused by ring-billed gulls.
What's the cause of the other 90%?
The other 90%, it's a variety of songbird species, waterfowl species, raptor species. We deal with all of these in relevance on the airfield as well. We don't just focus on gulls. We have a strong program here that looks at all wildlife hazards to aircraft, whether large or small. And obviously, as you start to increase the size of bird species, body mass wise, you're now increasing that overall hazard to aircraft.
Sure.
And Jake, can you give us, we don't have the report that you're talking about, but can you give us a ballpark on like how many impacts on average per year? 10% of what?
That's 10% as a whole since 1990. Essentially, what the FAA and airports have done is increase strike reporting since the Hudson incident happened back in 2008, I believe it was. The data that's kept on a national database for all major airports, all certificated airfields in general, the data goes back to 1990. So we have a strong historical data set to captivate, or capture all of the overall hazards that may be relevant or not relevant to aircraft safety at each airport. Now, airports vary drastically, geographically, and even throughout just a small state like Vermont as far as hazards go. Bird strikes also vary by year. Seasonality and weather conditions, for instance, can have a dramatic effect on just overall strikes of one bird species versus the next. We've seen that here historically over time, as well as at other airports.
And what's that order of magnitude, Jake? Like approximately how many bird strikes per year at BTV?
That also is going to vary greatly. One significant impact that can have on strike numbers is simply enplanement numbers. How many aircraft are simply flying at an airport can have a drastic change in, overall total bird strikes throughout the year. But on average, we're seeing anywhere from, 18 to 22 strikes a year with varying bird species here at the airport. Some of which do create quite a bit of damage for aircraft via ingestions or, physical damage to fuselage and whatnot.
Have you had any examples of collisions with crows flying to or from their roosts?
Yeah, there historically, there's a handful of crow strikes at Burlington as well as at all airfields. Crows do a really good job of avoiding aircraft. Other species like gulls and birds of prey like raptors, hawks, owls, and falcons do not. It's the way they fly. Typically, crows typically cross the airfield in a real quick fashion. Gulls can sometimes take their time in getting across. Gulls also will tower. They'll kettle a lot like a hawk will. A lot of pilots actually misidentify gulls towering as birds of prey. So the way birds simply fly through the sky and aerial forage is also indicative of how frequently they are or are not struck by aircraft.
Very interesting.
We are running out of time, but Eric, I saw a couple comments in the chat. If you wouldn't mind just voicing them so that everybody hears them.
Okay, I could do that. Apologize for the background noise. It's F-35s, which I guess is probably affecting everybody. So I just, listening to the conversation here, I think a lot of my comments were addressed already, but I would suggest that I think I heard someone offer that Eric Wells listened to videos of the bangers. It would make a lot more sense for him and others from the town to actually witness them in person rather than just listening or watching a video. And the bird strikes thing, that's easy to address. That can just be normalized to the number of strikes per planes, either taking off or landing or both per year. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Commissioners, any other comments or questions at this time while we have Jake and Joe to answer?
I guess my thought is going back to trying an alternative method first with the filament, because I go to the dump regularly and I rarely see gulls there. I see crows and I see the pigeons, but really I don't see gulls. And I think that that filament really is, and maybe we should have the folks from Solid Waste District from Redmond Road speak to that, and talk about how effective it is, because really I don't see gulls over there at all. And I just, I hate to say it, but I think this is just the wrong place for this operation. Maybe food scrap operation should not be put next to an airport. And that maybe I love that it separates out all these different packaging and being able to recycle. But I think, if there's another spot that Casella has a piece of land that they could do this process at, that would eliminate the problem right there. I'm surprised that they didn't research this before they put that operation there, right next to the airport, knowing that food attracts birds, and that this would be a problem. I know it's just been since July, but yeah, those are just my comments to, maybe try a different alternative first before using these bangers, which seem to be, pretty loud. And here I've got an F-35 flying over me, and, we were told that they were going to be 60 decibels. I'm clocking 128. So I'm not sure how different the bird bangers will be. That's all I have.
And Eric, as far as demonstration purposes go, please feel free to reach out to myself or the airport at any time to come hopscotch over, and we will gladly give demonstrations. We've done it to the cities of Burlington as well as South Burlington for quite some time. So please feel free. I do want to extend that invite.
Thanks, Jake. I may reach out to the select board to see if their members are interested, as they'll have the policy-making decision authority here as well.
Jake, it seems to me like you do a lot more measurables than I've read about or seen about in the literature or in the information that we've had up to now. And I would say that if you do go ahead with this project, that you would make these measurables readily available to the town of Williston, so that we can all get an idea of the effectiveness and potential adverse effects of this program.
I have one question for Jake and Joe, and that is if these noise devices were a variance was granted for a period of time as like a trial, how would that impact, in your view, the effectiveness? For instance, if the select board permitted it for 2022 spring through summer to compare to 2021 spring and summer bird counts and observations. What are your views on something like that?
I think we may be able to show some real short-term effectiveness, with immediate success. And Joe touched on the variability of bird activity at this facility, and that varies widely as well. The variability of bird observations is going to have more, more play than just simply whether we're using pyrotechnics or not. So I do want to reiterate, there's other variables that are going to come into play for, why birds may be at this location at one year more than others. We see that. You can see, just to point out, gull numbers in an ag field can vary from one year to the next just by, say, earthworm eruptions. There's all kinds of other variables that need to be taken into effect. But certainly, I would not shy away from entertaining this on a trial basis to see, what effectiveness it does or doesn't have. And for Joe's sake at the facility to see what kind of, impact it may have to the neighboring community, to see what kind of responses there as well.
Yeah, we might learn that the pyrotechnics are not effective. And, we might scrap it. We just don't know. And, look, I mean, our main goal with what we do is to protect human health and safety. It's what we do. We manage everybody's trash, we manage everybody's recycling, and now we're managing everybody's food scraps. Not everybody's, but certainly our customers. And we want to do that professionally. And when it comes to bird management, we're not bird experts. We need the help of USDA. We've been working with them for over 23 years. This is what is recommended, and we certainly want to give it a shot, whether it's a trial basis or not. We want to do what's right, and we certainly don't want to have an accident up at the airport. And the facility, is not going to move. We've got millions of dollars invested in this facility. We don't have other properties in this area. There's some synergies in having the trucks come and go from one location rather than dispersing trucks out, further away. We try to keep our carbon footprint as tightly as we can. What we do there is not going to change. We just want to control the gulls as best we can.
So I just was hearing, I guess Jake was saying that there's variables and things with, comparing farm fields to where the gulls are and the eruption of earthworms and things that brings them in. But this facility won't have any variables really, because there's constantly going to be this food source there. And I would imagine it's only going to increase over time because of the growth of Williston and more people. That means more food scraps. So the bird bangers, I would think, are going to be here once they're put in place. They're going to be here for the foreseeable future. That the gulls are not going to just disappear with the bangers. They'll come back as long as the food is there. They'll be coming back year after year. So this is definitely a long-term plan. I think that it's not a short-term solution. It's probably most likely going to be a long-term policy or management tool that's going to be in place. Is that correct?
Well, all projects we have are long-term. Like I said, there's not a quick instant cure-all aside from creating a bubble that birds can't fly into, which simply is not going to happen. We chuckle about airports itself all the time. Let's put a bubble around it so birds can't fly in. It's just not going to happen. What I was referencing more with the earthworm and ag field type situation is because that's what people tend to see. When you drive by a freshly tilled field, you see gulls on it. It's because there's food there. And the reference I like to make in that is that with natural food availability in abundance, say a bumper crop of earthworm flooding in the month of May via, heavy rains, or even an alewife die-off on Lake Champlain, well, that will simply draw gulls away from a supplemental food source like Casella to those areas. So we could see that occur in a matter of days, just naturally by the birds are there to pick through what food waste is available, to then targeting a natural food source, say at an ag field on the water. We see that. Ring-billed gulls are actually very predatory gull species. I think the misconception is gulls are always at trash and dumps and beaches, and they are to some extent, but they're also very good at what they do, and they're huge insect and bug eaters, as well as fish eaters as well itself. So I just wanted to give that as a kind of comparison to say, gull activity from one day to the next can vary. And I'm sure Joe would attest to the fact that one day there can be a lot of birds there versus the next day when you show up, there's hardly a bird to be seen. So that definitely varies day to day, week to week, and from one season to the next.
So Eric and Melinda, the two things that resonate with me that were discussed today are, one, measurability. I'd like to know that we have a plan for how to measure pre, during, and post implementation, if any, so that we can determine whether it's being an effective measure, how often it needs to be used in order to be effective, those sorts of things at this particular location. And the other being the idea that it's likely to not be a cure-all. I think nobody here is saying that using pyrotechnics is going to stop the bird problem. So the question really becomes, what is the long-term mix of techniques that are going to work? We don't know the answer to that right now, but Terry has brought up the filament, which has not yet been implemented. Joe, it sounds like there's some, it's been considered. There are some challenges. Potentially some of those challenges can be addressed to try a method like that. But I would just like to see a focus on what the long-term holistic approach is, and then also tying it to the metrics that the data-driven decision-making that Carl was talking about. Those are my comments. And if there are any final comments from other commissioners, now's the time before we enter our other business updates.
It looks like to me that there are a lot of posts about actually moving the facility. And I just wanted to mention that. I know Eric had to move on to his day job, but he also put that into the chat.
Thanks, Laura. Any other comments? Carl, Terry, Gary, and Kim, I saw you slipped on too. Any comment, Kim?
No, I've been coming in and out as I get my children ready to leave the house. So I don't feel like I have thought about it enough to formulate substantive questions at this point.
Thanks, Kim. Eric, is there anything else you would like us to address on this topic to support the select board?
I appreciate the discussion this morning. Maybe look to Melinda and I to sum this up in a memo to the board. We can pass on the commission's comments, and then appreciate the offer from USDA and Casella to observe the devices, and I'll extend an invitation to the select board as well. And I've gotten some feedback from other businesses in the area, so I'm working to develop kind of a visual of what the potential noise impact could be in terms of a radius. They've mentioned this morning, a couple 100 yards most likely. So I'll look to put a visual on that and circulate that as well.
Thanks, Eric. Joe and Jake, thank you so much for joining us for the conversation today. We appreciate your engagement.
Thank you guys all as well, and I appreciate it. I'm going to leave, get to duties, and we'll be in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, Melinda, next up, we have the staff report. Looks like Catamount is on the list.
I'm going to run to my 9 o'clock meeting, but good to see everyone. Thanks for your service on the commission, especially during COVID here. So I hope to come to a meeting in person sometime soon, and we can do that again. So thank you all. Have a good day. Thanks.
Melinda, would you like me to go ahead with Catamount?
Sure. And then I just have one small thing to add when you're done. So.
Okay. Do you want to start with that?
Okay, sure. So Elliot Lathrop from Heritage Builders came out to Catamount to have a look at the barn. He's going to prepare a conditions assessment report But anyway, so that'll be interesting to see what turns up. He, just as we were chatting there, he mentioned the idea of perhaps moving the barn to a new foundation and using it as like an open air pavilion with maybe, I don't know, a second story with, I don't know, an office or storage. So I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. But we'll see what we get for his cost estimates. He's going to basically split up potential renovation into 3 different phases of increasing, I don't know, cost, I guess. The first being stabilization, and then, and then a next phase, and then a next phase that might include renovation for future use. So anyway, that's all.
Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Melinda, can you just remind me that barn is on the list of historic structures, right? Are there like special, what does, if that is right, that it's on that list, does that mean that there are other considerations that have to go into renovation?
Yeah, so that structure is on the state list of historic structures. I may even, yeah, I'm not sure whether it's federally listed or not, but we are required to maintain it. We can't just let it fall down. We can't demolish by neglect, as they say, or so we are required to maintain it. And it has, if we do any work on it, it has to be done in consultation with the Division of Historic Preservation.
So, but the like moving it to a different foundation would like not violate any of those parameters, or we are not sure?
We're not sure.
Okay. Just curious.
All right. The only other items that may be of interest is that we're forming some walks this summer, starting in July. First, we have a bird banding that Audubon and Ethan Tapper are kind of putting on June 6th. Also in June, on the second Saturday, I think Terry is giving a bird walk. Is that right, Terry? We decided on that date.
Yeah, I think it was June 19th.
Yep. And then in July, we're doing an invasive walk. August, we're going to do some type of naturalist walk that I will figure out soon. And then in September, October, and possibly November, we'll be doing some invasive removal with volunteers. So that's just in the works. And we did talk about other ways to engage the public, but I just wanted to let you know what we're doing this summer.
Laura, it's so wonderful to hear about more public engagement activities at Catamount. It's a really important thing given the town's acquisition. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tim, you looked very happy about that. Is there anything that you'd like to see at Catamount?
No, I think everything there is going in a real positive direction. Staffing at the cross country center was a little sketchy this year, but that's something that's probably going to get fixed over time. But it's a great resource. I walk there often. Long term, my great concern would be it becomes popular. I'll just throw in Sucker Brook entrance. That trail has been decimated by traffic and needs a ton of work. So I'm supportive of closures at certain times here that are forced and to protect the area from the traffic that's attracted to it. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And just so you know, the Catamount Outdoor Family Center, the nonprofit that maintains the trails there, and they're the ones that run the mountain biking and cross country skiing. They do a great job maintaining the trails and closing the trails when they need to be closed. So.
Yes, they're able to do it that's so much more granular level than than we're able to across our entire network as a town.
Yeah.
And just so you know, Tim, one thing we've talked about a lot recently is how to balance the need to provide additional locations to spread out the strain of recreation with limited funds and time to maintain and monitor, et cetera. We already have I forget how many miles, but a lot of miles of trail that are maintained with limited staffing. So we're constantly trying to find that balance between providing opportunities and maintaining what we've got.
Yeah, so I'll look for volunteer efforts on that to support you.
I have a comment I'd like to make on grassland bird nesting this year at Catamount. We've had 2 successful seasons for bobolinks the last 2 years. This year, it's going to be, it may not be as successful. And the reason for this is that Harold, the farmer who contracts to mow the fields, is allowed to mow once on the bobolink field before June 1st. The last 2 years, the weather has prevented him from doing so. This year, not so much. Monday, he mowed that field. So the bobolink nesting site is very short at this point. Now he mowed early enough so that the grass may grow up high enough so that there will be successful nesting, but it remains to be seen. So we'll be monitoring that. And this being the last year of his contract, Linda, I'm hoping that when we do his new contract next year, that we can actually eliminate all mowing on the bobolink field until August 1st. So that he doesn't have he doesn't mow in May. But anyway, this year is going to be a good opportunity to see the effect of May mowing.
Yeah, I was going to say it's unfortunate in that it may affect it, but it's also an opportunity to learn what does and does not impact. Yep.
Exactly.
Earl, do you think that this fall is the time to restart conversations, or at least think about conversations about the bobolink project? Is that grant program still running? My memory is that we couldn't make it happen when we were writing the management plan to secure the Forest Service funding for the acquisition of Catamount, but that the way it was left was that we would potentially touch base with Patrice in the future and see if it made sense for those fields. Do you think that's worth digging up again, and is the fall the right time for that?
Well, that whole bobolink program doesn't get started until early in the year, but if we wanted to try to talk Patrice into it, we ought to start earlier, like maybe the fall. I'm not too optimistic there, but could always try.
But is there a 10-acre minimum?
Pardon me?
Is there a 10-acre minimum? Oh, yeah.
I think that's kind of their guidelines. I don't know how closely they follow that, but it's not so much. I don't think it's so much entering the program and getting the funds to do it as much as it is if Patrice were agreeable on her adjacent field, we would just have a much larger breeding area.
I wonder if, because you've been monitoring for the last few years and you have, you can document how many pairs were there each year, if it might be a more attractive project for them, because we know there's evidence that bobolinks nest there and have nested successfully. It's just a thought.
Yeah, well, I would certainly think that if we did approach her, that we ought to let her know what what our information, what our data is for the last couple of years.
Yeah, not so much Patrice, but I mean, if the program could be convinced, even without Patrice's participation, based on the documented nesting and breeding on the field.
That's a good point. That the program, might be good for the program to know that you can have success on a field that's pretty small. I think that field itself is about 8 acres.
Mhm.
So
I
yeah,
believe
that's a
that
good
the
point.
I just put a link to the project in the chat, and I think it, unless I'm thinking of a different bobbling project, I think the acreage might even be higher. I think I think it's worth chatting with Patrice because she was open to considering it on when we had discussions in the Catamount committee. I think it just got a little bit bogged down. I mean, that committee had so many issues, right? It just didn't happen quickly, and we came up with sort of like an interim solution that didn't require, not an interim solution, but
Yeah, not because it wasn't appetizing, but because it couldn't be tackled at the moment.
and because like there were like, it was going to be complicated to try to be like, okay, we're going to have this like cross boundary management goal and objective nested within this other plan that doesn't also cross bound, you know what I mean? Like there was many levels of management that we were trying to do. And so it just didn't make sense to try to like do this with her property while we were also trying to write a management plan specific to Catamount. Tim, the bobolink, Carl can tell me if this is wrong, but the bobolink nesting area at Catamount is on the south side of the road. There's that field, that open, those like sort of 3 open fields. And the one where the bobolink's nest is the one where the pond is, and then there's 2 that are south of there. And I think, Carl, that like a long time ago maybe there was bobolink nesting pair on like the most southern west field, but there hasn't been recently. Is that true?
The bobbling field is the easternmost field on the south side, the one that's contiguous with River Hill Farm, that big field on River Hill Farm. There have been bobolinks present on the other 2 fields on the south side. I don't know that we've ever documented nesting in the other fields, but we don't, you know, since we haven't historically done it, we don't monitor those as closely.
And those fields are mowed.
And those fields are
Times a year.
right. They're mowed.
So I have a question about, you know, joining this bobolink program. Usually what the idea is to incentivize for the farmers not to mow that first or second cut. So the farmers are paid for their loss.
Yes.
Right.
So with that, so thinking that Harold's going to get paid the money for the lost hay, and possibly Patrice, is that, I mean, would the town be applying for those?
Yeah, I think that's the idea, right? Is to like incentivize farmers to put the, you know, to enroll in this project, right? Like the same idea as grant programs that incentivize farmers to take parts of their fields out of production to do riparian planting. Sort of this like, how do we make it easy for people to do the ecologically to do the conservation driven thing?
Take the money issue out of it.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that is something that Patrice seemed to be interested in and may continue to be interested in. Carl had made an observation a few years ago that is not her best cut of hay, right? She mows other fields first. And so if you could pay a farmer for not their best cut of hay, that seems like a pretty strong incentive to, you know, make a conservation management decision more appealing. This is all just to say, like, I just wanted to say, like, is it worth it? Should somebody think about talking to her maybe in the fall?
Good idea. I think that would be a good idea.
Melinda, do you know how much does Harold pay the town for mowing the fields over there?
He doesn't pay the town anything.
Oh, so he's getting all this hay for free.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So he's not losing any income really. I mean,
He's
losing
losing
that cut, but
potential
he's not
income,
paying.
but not, yeah,
Right.
but not paying for something he's not able to work on.
Hmm.
Taking a peek at the time, we're over by a few minutes. We had a jam-packed agenda today. Any further discussion of the Catamount updates, or do we have a motion to adjourn?
I just have one quick thing. So all the Bluebird boxes are up. Got 3 volunteers to monitor the boxes over there. We have a lot of tree swallows and yeah, so, but there is activity in all the boxes, which is great news. And one of my nest watchers found bluebird eggs in one of the boxes. So that was exciting. I have noticed an increase of swallow activity in the parking lot at Catamount. So there are birds flying around, which is probably from the boxes, but I plan to move some of those boxes. They're a little close together. I'm going to move them across the road from the parking lot over to the up the hill. And now that I can see where Harold doesn't mow, that actually will be a good idea to see where to place those. So they'll be out of the mowing stream. And Melinda, you met with Breyer, was it, for mowing and talked about mowing that side of the road on the south side. So that's going to happen in the fall.
Thank you, Terry, for all that work you do with the bobolinks.
Oh,
I mean,
Carl
not the
too.
bobolinks, the bluebirds.
The bluebirds, yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
those houses are amazing. Those done a
Yeah.
great job with those.
Yeah, they were fun. I'm not a carpenter, but I managed.
all right, and I'll make a motion to adjourn. Reed.
Thank you, Laura. We have a motion,
I'll second.
seconded by Terry. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.